Welcome to a brief discussion of neuroanatomy. You may know that there are formal terms for the X, Y, and Z axes of the brain. You can probably imagine how difficult it can be to use terms like right and left or front and back when you're looking at the brain from different angles. One way to section the brain is horizontal, which is basically what it sounds like. Another section is sagittal, which, as you might suspect, is etymologically related to the term Sagittarius, which is represented by an archer. So this is the axis along which you would fire an arrow. Another section is the coronal section. Coronal, as you may know, comes from the word for crown, so that might be helpful to remember. But it wouldn't be like a real round crown. It's the same axis as one of those headband birthday party type crowns. When we get down to the spinal cord, the three axes matter a little bit less, so we just call it a cross section. The next thing to talk about are some big picture parts of the brain. This may or may not be familiar. The biggest, most classically brain-like part of the brain is the cerebrum. The adjective is cerebral, which is sometimes used just to mean smart or brainy. You might say, he has a very cerebral sense of humor. You might already know that the biggest part of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. In fact, cortex means bark in Latin. The cortex is all crumpled up and convoluted. If you were to stretch it out, it would be about 3 feet by 3 feet and about 3 millimeters thick. It has 6 layers of cells. It has a left half and a right half, and these are organized contralaterally, which I should mention means opposite sides. So the right side of the cortex controls the left half of the body and vice versa. The cerebral cortex is responsible for what we might loosely call conscious experience. It controls voluntary movement, it processes sensory input, helps you plan and talk, and in essence, think. The next major brain part is the cerebellum, which you may or may not know means little brain in Latin. This structure is indeed like a little brain. It only has 3 layers of cells instead of 6, and it only makes up about 10% of the brain by volume. But it has a lot of super tiny and densely packed cells. More than half of the neurons in the brain are in the cerebellum. It is organized ipsilaterally, which, as a note, means same side. So the right cerebellum controls the right side of the body and vice versa. The cerebellum is responsible for balance and for well-practiced, precisely timed series of motor movements, like learning a specific dance routine or typing out a familiar password. The sorts of things that are often called motor memory would more accurately be called cerebellar memory. The last big picture brain part on this image is the brainstem, which is a series of structures that is sort of like the stem of a flower. It is largely comprised of white matter tracts that connect the brain to the spinal cord. It doesn't have 2 hemispheres, although some of the structures inside of it are mirrored. If people talk about a lizard brain, it's likely the functions they're referring to exist in the brainstem. It's responsible for basic life functions like breathing and heart rate and such. As I mentioned, the cerebral cortex is convoluted, meaning it's both bumpy and groovy. You might already know the technical names for these structures. A bump is called a gyrus. Plural bumps are called gyri. A groove is called a sulcus. Plural grooves are called sulci, or sometimes sulci. If the groove is especially deep, it is sometimes called a fissure. For the most part, the patterns of gyri and sulci are the same across different human brains. Here are 2 views of a brain, and you might be able to see some of the major sulci. Here are 3 major sulci labeled. On the brain on the right, separating the left and right cerebral hemispheres, is, as a note, the longitudinal fissure. On the left, running along the side of the brain, is the lateral fissure. This image depicts the left lateral fissure, but there is a mirrored lateral fissure in the right hemisphere as well. These 2 are so deep that they're usually called fissures, but it would be equally correct to refer to them as sulci. The sulcus that is depicted on both brains in this image is the central sulcus, or central fissure, which runs more or less along the coronal plane near the middle of the brain, again in both hemispheres. Here is a picture of the brain with the different lobes color-coded and labeled. The major sulci are partially what divides the cortical lobes. The central sulcus divides the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. The lateral fissure divides the temporal lobe and the frontal and parietal lobes. The dividing line for the occipital lobe can be a little bit less obvious, so we won't get into it today. You might already know about the different functions that the lobes have. The occipital lobe is responsible for early visual processing. Then temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, memory, and some later parts of visual processing that involve recognizing the identity of objects and faces. The parietal lobe is responsible for our sense of touch and spatial perception, including some later parts of vision that involve location. The frontal lobe does lots of fancy cognitive stuff that we could abstractly think about as planning. This includes short-term motor planning, like I'm going to move my arm, but also long-term planning, like I want to be a lawyer someday. That's it for now. Hopefully, after this discussion, you are able to recognize the axes used to discuss 3D brain structure, label big picture brain areas and major sulci, and identify the location and function of the four lobes of the brain. Thanks for being here.